To study the biblical character of Jacob is to open up several cans of worms, to say the least. We have already, in our study of Jacob, we've already seen the sovereignty of God contrasted to predestination. We've seen foreknowledge contrasted to predetermination. The studies also showed us that God uses flawed people without endorsing their sin. That's really a big lesson in Jacob, because Jacob is definitely a flawed person. He's a big sinner, and yet God still uses him. Well, today's account introduces three new characters to our story that are going to stay with Jacob for, well, two of them are going to stay with Jacob for a long, long time, but all three for the next 20 years or so. Jacob's going to meet his uncle Laban, that is his mom's brother. And then Laban has two daughters, Rachel and Leah. So that's the three new characters in our study today. But also today's study is going to bring some more absurd issues to the forefront. And so I'm going to get to some little lighter things later on in the message, but we got to deal with these couple of really absurd things to begin with. The first one is this: did Jacob marry his first cousin? And the answer is yes, he did. And if you read the passage, he married his first cousin. So we got to deal with that issue first. Don't any of y'all get any ideas, okay? So what's going on with this? Well, to explain Jacob marrying his first cousin, we really need to go back to the creation account of Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve were created, it says a few chapters later in Genesis 5, verse 4, it says that they had sons and daughters. And the question comes, who did their sons marry? Well, they married their sisters, because there was nobody else on planet Earth to marry. And so sometimes people like to trap Bible folks and say, well, who did Cain marry? Well, he married his sister. I'm sorry. There was nobody else on the earth to marry. If there had been another choice, he'd have picked her, but there were no other choices. So that's what happened. Now, I do want you to know that by the time Leviticus 18 occurs in the Bible, that is forbidden, okay? And why is this? Well, early on in the human history, it was necessary for close relatives to marry because the population was so small. There was not a genetic issue then, because that like would eventually be, because the gene pool had not been corrupted with genetic disorders or diseases, which also eliminated the recessive gene issue as well. So nearly for the first 1,500 years of the human race, marriage between close relatives occurred. When Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac, God led that servant to Abraham's family, and Isaac would marry Rebekah. She's been in our study earlier. And Rebekah is Isaac's first cousin once removed. Have you ever heard that and wondered what in the world does that mean? First cousin once removed. Well, I finally figured it out. It was his aunt's granddaughter. It wasn't his aunt's daughter, it was his aunt's granddaughter. That's what it means when someone says first cousin once removed. If we carefully follow the biblical genealogy, what we find is that in the patriarch lineage, that is the key people in the Hebrew heritage, Hebrew lineage, we find that they all come back to Terah, which is Abraham's grandfather. On both the male and the female side, they all trace back to this one guy, Abraham's father, Terah. And so when Jacob marries Rachel and Leah, he is ensuring that his children will be entirely on both sides the descendants of his great-grandfather, Terah. Now, of all the jokes flying around in our world today about marrying your first cousin, I thought it would be worth looking that up, if that's legal or not. And you'll be surprised to find out about the good old United States. According to January 20th, 2022, So we're talking about recent data. The article from Data Mining DNA, 19 of the 50 U.S. states do not prohibit first cousins from marrying. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Good news, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, Mississippi do prohibit you marrying your first cousin, okay? Something about Alabama further east. I don't know. I just read the data. And then, of course, California. Okay, I mean, just go figure it out from there. So, though we are quite a modern culture, 19 of our 50 states do not have a legal issue with first cousins marrying each other. So it sure wasn't a legal issue in Jacob's day. More importantly, it was not a moral issue. So that's the first thing we can set to the side. The second issue really is the bigger issue because it's a moral issue. Jacob marries two women. Not to say they were sisters. I mean, that's just crazy right there. But two women. What is the deal with Old Testament patriarchs marrying more than one woman? Or either they have sexual relationships with their servant or their concubine. And if you don't know what a concubine is, it's worse than a porcupine. I'll just leave it at that, okay? I mean, it's bad news. So what is the deal about these Old Testament personalities that are actually part of the historical fabric of the Hebrew people, which become the Jewish people? What is the deal with them having multiple wives? We have to understand two things here to explain this. One is there is a difference between the Bible recording information about a person and actually instruction on how to live. There's a difference between those two things. The Bible is very clear about its heroes. They were quite imperfect. They missed the mark frequently. They sinned. If the Bible was legend, if it was fable, probably wouldn't write anything bad about its heroes. But because the Bible is historical fact, it tells the whole truth about them, even if that truth is rather ugly sometimes. And often that ugliness demonstrated itself in marrying multiple women and having sexual relationships outside of marriage. However, the Bible never says in those settings, whether it was Abraham, whether it's Jacob, or later whether it's David, the Bible never says go and do likewise. The Bible never holds up their sexual misconduct as an example of how we ought to live. It just simply records, here's the facts about these people, this is how they lived. On the other hand, when the Bible instructs, when it gives instructions on how to live, it is quite clear. It is one man and one woman committed in marriage for life. Genesis 1 and 2, Proverbs 5, Matthew 19, Ephesians 5, 1 Peter 3, several chapters in 1 Corinthians, all say one man, one woman committed for life. That's God's instructions. And every time in the Old Testament there were multiple wives, there were multiple problems. Abraham, he had sexual relationships with a servant, and we're still living under that mess right now. It's the trouble between Arabs and Jewish people come from that decision. Jacob's going to have multiple wives, plus servant women on top of that. His 12 sons are so dysfunctional, it makes all of us look normal. It's just one mess after another. David has one mess after another, all because they did not follow God's original intent, one man, one woman committed to life in marriage. So now that we've got those two rather sticky issues out of the way, let's look at our passage. Let me catch you up on where we're at in our study. Jacob deceived, tricked his brother so much he has to run for his life. And so last week on the run, God, out of his grace, encounters him in spite of his deceit. You can be on the run and God will still encounter you. Well, after that encounter, he's still continuing towards the area of Haran, where his mother's family is from. Also, that's where his grandfather Abraham spent many decades at. Abraham was 75 before he left that area, and so there's a lot of family there in that area. And he gets close to Haran, and he sees a water source there, and he sees that shepherds are gathering to water their sheep. He says to the shepherds, he says, any of you guys know a man named Laban? He's my uncle. I'm looking for him. And they say, oh, yeah, we know Laban. He's a very famous shepherd here, very herdsman. We know him well. In fact, that's his daughter right there bringing the sheep up. Her name is Rachel. So Jacob introduces himself to Rachel, actually helps her water the sheep and so forth. And we pick up the action in Genesis chapter 29, starting with verse 13. So Genesis 29, starting with verse 13, says this. When Laban, that's the uncle, heard the news about his sister's son Jacob, he ran to meet him, hugged him and kissed him, and that would be the normal Middle Eastern greeting that men would give each other. Then he took him to his house, and Jacob told him all that had happened. Laban said to him, yes, you are my own flesh and blood. In other words, he says, yes, I'm your uncle and you are my nephew. After Jacob had stayed with him a month, Laban said to him, well, just because you're my relative, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. Now, Laban had two daughters. The older one was named Leah and the younger one was named Rachel. Leah had tender eyes. Now, your translation may say weak eyes. A couple of different ways that could be translated. It may just mean that she had droopy eyes, or probably it means that she wasn't easy to look at. That's probably what it means. She wasn't very attractive. So Leah had tender eyes, verse 17, but Rachel was shapely and beautiful. Jacob loved Rachel, so he answered Laban, I'll work for you for 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. Laban replied, better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay with me. So Jacob worked 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Oh, isn't that sweet? Too bad the story doesn't end there. I really just want to unpack two big things today. The first one is things that God endorses in a relationship between a husband and a wife. What pleases God between a husband and a wife? Jacob is not a good example on very many things. In fact, most of Jacob's life is what not to do. So when we run across something Jacob does right, we need to be sure and emphasize it. And so here's a case in which he actually does some things right. So let me show you 4 things here about the husband-wife relationship, and part of it is just men and women. The first one is this. Chivalry is honorable and should not be viewed as condescending or insulting. Now, let's look at this. In verse 10, Jacob is at this water source. Some of the shepherds are starting to gather with their herds. And I don't know exactly how it works, but there was some rock, a large rock they had to move to get to the water. I don't know if it was covering the mouth of a spring or if it was the entry into an area, but there was a huge rock. They had to move the rock before they could get the herds to the water. And so what the shepherds would do, they would wait till all the herds got there, so there were plenty of men, and the men would move the rocks, and then they would water. All the flocks would be watered, then the men would move the rocks back. Just when the first man got there, he didn't pull the rock back because it was too big. It was too heavy. He couldn't. He had to wait till more people got there, and then they would water. Well, Jacob gets there, and as soon as they point out that that's Rachel coming, he says, well, what are we waiting on? Let's get this rock moved. And supernaturally, I guess, I don't know how else he did it, supernaturally, he moves the rock by himself. And instead of Rachel having to do the work of getting the sheep there, he gets the sheep there and gets Rachel's sheep watered. And this will be the first of many times in which Jacob will do something that will benefit Laban. Now today, feminism suggests that women can do anything a man can do and even better. And the point of this message is not to argue that, but trying to be men and act like men, women might actually miss out on being a woman. Feminism first devalued men. So instead of equality, it downplayed men. It put men down. It said, we can do everything better than a man can. It put men down. But now, in the last half dozen years, it has started devaluing womanhood. It's promoted womanhood as bigotry, that it should be reserved not just for women, but men ought to be able to claim the values of womanhood, and they ought to be able to claim womanhood as well. But I want you to know there's nothing demeaning or condescending about a man being a man and a woman being a woman. It doesn't say anything about weakness if a man is fully a man and a woman is fully a woman. God made us, I'm not talking about spiritually, I'm talking about socially and relationally. God made men to find their value in certain things and women to find their values in certain things. And it doesn't mean we're less because we find our value the way God made us. Men, God made us to provide and to protect. Does not mean that women cannot provide and cannot protect. But primarily, men find their value, they found their esteem by providing and protecting. God gave women in their esteem to nurture and to care. Doesn't mean that men can't nurture and men can't care. Doesn't mean that. But primarily a woman finds her value, her esteem in nurturing and caring. So it doesn't mean that Diane, if she's good at something, that I should do it. If she's good at it, I ought to be smart enough to let her do it. And it also doesn't mean that Diane shouldn't take advantage of 6'4" to reach stuff. Instead of trying to 5'1", I still don't know where the one's at, reaching the stuff, okay? There you go. We're good, we're good. I mean, why in the world should I make her climb up on a ladder to change a light bulb when I can just reach up there and do it? I mean, does that devalue her by using my strength? When you are used the way God designed you to be used, you find your value in how God has made you. And that is not a weakness, that's a sign of strength. So first, chivalry is honorable. It should not be viewed as condescending or insulting. If a man wants to open a door for you, let him open a door for you. Does that make you weak? No, it doesn't make you weak. Why would that make you weak? And so forth. Secondly, love is worth waiting for. Jacob could have taken a woman from the Hittite tribe. That's what his brother Esau did. The Hittites were the tribe around where Isaac and his family lived. And the Hittites came from a totally different religion. They were polytheistic, which means multiple gods. Isaac and his family, coming from Abraham, they were monotheistic. They worshiped Jehovah God only. And so when Esau married these pagan women, then it meant that his children were going to be influenced by these pagan influences of polytheism, multiple gods. Plus, it was a whole different moral code. God has a certain moral code. Later on, God would express that moral code through the Ten Commandments. But these other pagan gods, it was a free-for-all morally. You could do whatever you wanted to. So when Esau married people what we would call outside the faith, the result was his children were conflicted about who and what they were supposed to follow. 2 Corinthians warns against believers, that is Christ followers, marrying unbelievers. Really doesn't leave any room for discussion on that subject. When Jacob got to Haran, he met Rachel. And yet he still waited. We'll read the passage a little bit later, but he still waited. He waited 7 years before he touched her in a way that a man touches a woman the way God designed that. So he waited. This thing about playing house without the commitment of marriage does not strengthen a relationship. Relationships are strengthened between a man and a woman under the context of the commitment called marriage. So love is worth waiting for. Thirdly, love is worth working for. So Jacob works for Rachel, he works to get Rachel 7 years, works for his future father-in-law for 7 years. And according to verse 20, it seemed like only a few days to him because he was so enamored. He was so in love with her. He was so charmed by her. Jacob's love had the power to make him work those 7 years in and not feel like it was hard labor or anything like that. Authentic love is worth waiting, but it's also worth working for. Now, we could start around the room. We'll just start over here with the O'Neills, and we'll just go around and let everybody give a testimony on how hard it is in marriage. And it is. Maybe not for the O'Neills, but for everybody else. Now, there may be that rare couple out there that you say, it's just been easy for us. We just never had any problems. It's just been really easy. But I can assure you, you are in the minority. Marriage is hard work. You throw two people together that are designed to do two different things, and you throw them together in the same house for a while, they're going to fight. There's going to be problems. It's going to be hard work. That's why commitment in marriage is important, because that's what sustains you in those dry times, in those difficult times, in those challenging times. But this story, oh man, it turns bad. This story really, it's like a bad joke, because instead of, after working 7 years, Jacob getting Rachel, who he thought he was working for all this time, the dad switches on the wedding day and he gets Leah unbeknownst to him. That leads me to the fourth thing here, and that is love sometimes blinds us to other harmful forces. In verse 18, it says that Jacob loved Rachel. And that word love, typically it describes the affection and romance between a man and a woman. I don't know if it was love at first sight. I don't know when she was bringing up the sheep if he just said, man, that's the one. But it says that after just working a month, he was already in love with her. So he was pretty charmed by her. So it didn't take long, and he's in love with her. But with that love, it blinded him to his future father-in-law, who was just as tricky or trickier than he was. Sometimes love can blind you to other harmful things that might go on. So that's the first thing we look at, is kind of the man-woman, husband-wife relationship. Second big thing to unpack is on the subject of deceit. Deceivers can be susceptible to themselves. See, a con artist is so arrogant, and Jacob was a con artist. A con artist is so arrogant that it leads him to make the mistake that he believes he's always running the con, and what he doesn't realize is sometimes the con is running on him. And that's exactly what happens. Jacob meets someone that's a bigger liar than he is. It's going to be his father-in-law. And so the liar gets lied to. The one who has manipulated gets manipulated. Sin begets sin, and so often is the case, God allows our very sins that we committed to come back on us, and that's what happens to Jacob. Let me show you 4 things about deception. First, when we take advantage of others, we are often taken advantage of. I don't expect you to remember, it's been several weeks ago in our first study of Jacob. His brother Esau, they're twins. His brother Esau has gone out hunting all day. He comes back and he's just famished. He's starving. Jacob's got a pot of stew there that he's cooking and preparing. And Esau, in his short-sightedness, says, give me some food. I got to have some food. And Jacob manipulates the situation, takes advantage of his brother's weakness, and says, if you sell me your birthright, then I'll give you some stew. And Esau sells his birthright. He takes advantage of a situation. Now, same thing's going to happen to Jacob. Jacob not only loves Rachel, but Jacob's broke. He doesn't have any money. So Laban, his uncle, says, yeah, you shouldn't work for free. What do you want me to pay you? He knows he doesn't have any money, and what he really wants is Rachel. And so he says, I'll work 7 years. That's a long time to work, okay? I'll work 7 years if you'll give me Rachel. Laban takes advantage of that. In fact, it's going to end up costing him a total of 14 years for Rachel. So when we take advantage of others, often we are taken advantage of. Secondly, about deception. When we deceive others, we often are deceived ourselves. Remember back in Genesis 27, it was 2 weeks ago, Jacob and his mother come up with this conniving plan on how to steal the blessing. Isaac calls his son Esau in and says, Esau, go hunt some game for me, and then when you kill the game, cook it up the way I like it, bring it into me. I'm getting ready to die. I'm going to give you a final blessing. Well, Jacob slips into that with his mother's guidance. He gets a couple of sheep from the herd, has mom cook them up just the way dad likes it, brings it in pretending to be Esau, so much so that he puts on the sheep skin on his arm because his brother's so hairy so he can seem hairy. He puts on his brother's clothes so he'll smell like his brother. And 3 different times he directly lies to his dad and says, I am Esau. He deceives, and now he is going to be deceived. We got to read it. Start with verse 21. Genesis 29, verse 21 says this. Then Jacob said to Laban, since my time is complete, give me my wife so I can sleep with her. He says, it's been 7 years. I'm ready to get my wife. So Laban invited all the men of the place and sponsored a feast. That evening, so it's dark, Laban took his daughter Leah and gave her to Jacob, and he slept with her. Laban gave his slave Zipporah as well to his daughter Leah as a slave. When morning came, there was Leah. So he said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? Wasn't it for Rachel that I'd worked for you? Why have you deceived me? Laban answered, it's not the custom in this place to give the younger daughter in marriage before the firstborn. Complete this week of wedding celebration, and I will also give you the younger one in return for working yet another 7 years for me. Laban substitutes Leah, the older sister, the less attractive sister, the one that Jacob does not love, substitutes her in place of Rachel on the wedding night. Now it's dark on the wedding night. She probably has a veil on, so he doesn't know. Jacob and Leah consummate the marriage, and then they wake up the next morning. Now you may wonder, how in the world could all that happen? I mean, can a guy tell the difference between two women? Well, actually, they still do today in that area. They dress very modest. It's not like these two women were running around for 7 years in swimsuit competition. I mean, they didn't know. I mean, they dressed very modest. It was at night, veil covered. They're sisters, so they probably have some similarities, and so he doesn't know. Goes to bed at night again, it's completely dark. He doesn't know. And then he wakes up the next morning, and the verse just says, and there was Leah. Now, you think you've had some bad stuff happen in your life? Man, I mean, just get this. This is creepy bad. I mean, you think you're marrying somebody, and then you have the honeymoon night, you roll over the next morning, and man, it's the ugly sister instead. I mean, what do you do with that? And so he goes to Laban and he says, man, I worked 7 years for the good looking one, and I got this one. What's up with that? It says that Laban had deceived him. See, the deceiver ends up getting deceived. Be careful how you treat people, because it'll end up coming back on you. Thirdly, when we use legalism to get what we want, legalism is often used against us. When Jacob stole the blessing from Esau with that trick, putting the sheepskin on him and acting like he was Esau, Esau comes back to Dad and says, Dad, don't you have any blessings for me? Can't you bless me at all? And Isaac says, our tradition is that once you bless a son, you fully bless him, he's totally blessed, and it's irrevocable. That was their legalism. Well, Jacob goes to Laban and says, what are you doing, man? Why did you give me this one? This is not the one I wanted. And he says, well, our tradition is the oldest one's got to get married first, so that's what you went. You know, legalism is fine when you've got the bat in your hand, but when the bat's in somebody else's hand, it can get pretty ugly. When you got to use legalism to get your way, it's probably going to come back and haunt you. It's probably going to beat you up one day too, so be careful with that. Jesus had more negative things to say about legalistic people than he did the publicans and the sinners. Fourthly, strained relationships built on manipulation often follow us. So when we build relationships, they're strained because of manipulation, that usually will come back and follow us. So for the first time in Jacob's life, Jacob is experiencing being on the receiving end of deception. His whole life, he's been deceiving, he's been tricking, he's been maneuvering things around to his advantage. And finally, out of nowhere, he gets deceived. He gets manipulated. He finally knows how Esau felt, which, by the way, is probably the first step to getting these two brothers back together. It's going to take a long time, but they are actually going to mend their relationship. And this is probably the first step. He finally knows how Esau has felt after all the deceptive things he's done to him. And he would end up receiving, unfortunately, more deception from his father-in-law, Laban, in the years to come. And we create much of the mess in our life, either for how we relate to God or how we relate to people. Now, I'm not saying that every mess is our fault. There are some things that are happening that are out of our control. You get diagnosed with cancer, it's out of your control. You had nothing to do with that. You're in a car wreck. Yeah, it's not your fault. You had nothing to do with that. But there's a lot of mess in our life that we created ourselves. And usually, it's because of how we're relating to God or how we're relating to other people. Maybe that's why when Jesus was cornered by a lawyer and was asked, what's the greatest commandment of them all? Jesus said this in Matthew 22, verse 37 and following. So he's asked, what's the greatest commandment of them all? And he says this, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. Actually, that is a summation of the first 4 Ten Commandments. That phrase is a summation of the first 4 commandments. It's about loving God with all that you are. You are messed up, and maybe you don't even know how messed up you are if you're not in full relationship with God. I'm talking about all of your passion, your heart. I'm talking about your spirit, your soul, your essence, your mind, your body. All of that is honoring God, is loving God, is in relationship with God, which only comes through repenting and placing faith in Jesus Christ. And if you haven't done that, your life is more messed up than you realize. It's eternally messed up. But the second thing that causes us problems is how we relate to each other. So the second command, Jesus says, in the next verse, Matthew 22, verse 39, he says the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commands depend the whole law and the prophets. Jacob is starting to learn that how you treat other people is how you're going to be treated. Jesus said it like this on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, verse 12. He says, do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. This is the essence of all that is taught in the law and the prophets. So as Jimmy makes his way to the front, I have two decisions for us to choose. One, are you fully in love with God? That is, you've come to God in the way He does relationships. God says the only way to have a relationship with Him is you have to repent of your sins and place your faith in Jesus Christ only. Are you loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your body? If you're not in that relationship, then here in a minute we're going to sing a song and the staff's going to be standing up here. You just come to one of us and say, I'm ready to give my life to Christ as my Savior. That's what I need. Second decision, is there somebody that you're not treating properly? Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's a classmate, a teammate, that you find them easy to put down because everybody else is putting down. You find them easy to be the butt of the joke because everybody else is joking about them. How you treat other people is eventually how you're going to be treated.